On our 40th birthday, my twin brother and I got gifts from our mother. She gave me a crumbling old cottage, and him, an apartment. Your place is in the dirt, my brother shouted, and Mom burst out laughing. I quietly sold the cottage and disappeared. A year later, my mother wrote to me in panic. Sweetheart, please, save your brother. He was homeless. I just smirked and replied, oh, did I forget to tell you that part? Don't forget to subscribe and leave a like. Enjoy the story. But before all that, there was another story, one that began on the day I turned 40. That day was supposed to be a celebration, but it became the end of my old life. The heavy scent of my aunt's perfume, mixed with the smell of hot steak and mayo-filled salads, seemed to fill every corner of the small banquet hall at the Golden Lion restaurant. Agnes sat at the table, perfectly straight, feeling a drop of sweat slide down her back under the thick fabric of her dress. 40. She and her brother had just turned 40. Half a lifetime, as people say. Except their halves couldn't have been more different. All eyes were on their mother. Evelyn Stafford, 67, with a harsh, commanding face and hair sprayed into a helmet, stood in the center of the room with a glass of champagne. She was giving a toast, or rather, an ode. An ode to her son, Daniel. My son, my Daniel, my pride. Her voice carried easily, used to commanding attention. Since childhood, you've always been special. A real man. You always knew what you wanted and took only the best from life. I always knew your path would be lined with roses. Daniel, her twin brother, lounged in his chair across from her. He soaked up their mother's admiring glances, smirking smugly as he patted his growing belly. He hadn't worked a single day since college, drifting from one shady project to another that always ended in nothing. But to their mother, he was a genius. A misunderstood talent who just hadn't gotten his big break yet. Agnes, on the other hand, had worked tirelessly since she was 20. A logistics manager for a major food company, a stressful job that demanded precision and nerves of steel. She supported herself, paid the mortgage on her small apartment, and still helped her mother financially whenever Evelyn complained about her tiny pension. But in her mother's eyes, Agnes was just a daughter, a mere appendix to her dazzling son. And on this special day, your 40th birthday, Evelyn declared, I want you to finally stand on your own 2 feet, to have your own nest, your own fortress. She paused, basking in the attention. Then she reached into her handbag, pulled out a small velvet box, and handed it to Daniel. He opened it. Inside, on a red cushion, lay a set of keys with a heavy keychain. These, my son, are the keys to your new downtown apartment. Fully renovated. Move in and enjoy. A wave of admiration rippled through the room. Daniel jumped up, hugged his mother, kissed her loudly. Applause broke out. Relatives lined up to shake his hand, to pat him on the back. Their cousin Nellie eyed the keys with open envy. Agnes sat perfectly still, smiling mechanically. She felt invisible, like glass everyone looked through to admire her brilliant brother. When the noise finally died down, Evelyn seemed to remember her daughter's existence. She turned to Agnes, her expression instantly losing all warmth. And as for you, Agnes. Evelyn rummaged in her oversized bag and pulled out an old, worn cardboard folder tied with a faded ribbon. Dust sprinkled down onto the pristine white tablecloth. Here, the deed to a country house. She tossed the folder onto the table in front of Agnes. Didn't hand it, tossed it, like throwing a bone to a dog. An awkward silence fell. Everyone knew that house. A sagging shack half buried in the ground on an acre and a half of overgrown weeds, a relic her grandfather once got from the company. The roof had caved in a decade ago, the fence had rotted, and the only amenity was a leaning outhouse in the far corner. The land itself was worthless, too poor even for a vegetable garden. The silence broke with Daniel's loud, mocking laugh. He looked at his sister, his face twisted into a cruel, triumphant grin. Your place is in the dirt, he shouted so everyone could hear. That's where you've always belonged, and where you'll stay. And the worst part, their mother, his mother, their mother, laughed. Not a nervous chuckle, not a polite smile, but a loud, hearty laugh, like he'd just told the funniest joke of his life. That laugh hit Agnes harder than a slap. She looked around the room. Some guests lowered their eyes in shame. Others pretended to steady their plates. Cousin Nellie smirked openly. Not one person, not one, stood up for her. Something snapped inside. That thin, fragile thread still connecting her to these people, to this family, burned to ashes. She no longer felt hurt or humiliated. Just a cold, ringing emptiness. Agnes rose slowly, with a dignity that seemed to come from nowhere. She picked up the dusty folder, brushed the crumbs off it, and slipped it carefully into her bag. Then she looked around the silent room, pausing for a moment on her smirking mother and brother. Without a word, she turned and walked toward the exit. She could feel dozens of eyes on her back as she crossed the hall. Each step echoed in her head. She didn't run, didn't hurry. She was simply leaving the restaurant, the family, the life where her place had been assigned long ago. Back home in her small, quiet apartment, she sat in the dark kitchen for a long time, the noise of the restaurant still echoing in her ears, her mother's laughter, her brother's shout, the silence of everyone else. She didn't cry. She'd run out of tears years ago. Finally, she took the old folder from her bag. Her hands untied the worn ribbon automatically. Inside were yellowed, brittle papers, a deed, a hand-drawn plot plan, old documents. Just what she expected. Trash. A symbol of her worthlessness in her mother's eyes. She was about to toss everything into the garbage when something stopped her. The folder felt thicker than it should have been. Agnes ran her fingers along the inside cover. There was a hidden layer. She pried it open with her nail. The cardboard peeled back easily, revealing a secret pocket no one had known about. Inside was a small sealed envelope. On it, in neat, familiar handwriting, was one word, Agnes. It was her father's handwriting. The father who had died 15 years ago. Her heart pounded so hard it felt like it might burst. Her hands trembled as she opened the envelope. Inside was a folded sheet torn from a school notebook. Just a few lines, written in that same beloved hand. My sunshine, forgive your mother. She doesn't know the real secret of this land. Show this to Sebastian Howell. He has the key. Agnes read the note once, twice, 3 times. The words blurred before her eyes. My sunshine. Only her father had ever called her that. She could almost hear his warm, slightly husky voice in the silent kitchen. Sebastian Howell. She vaguely remembered him, a tall, lean old man, her father's friend from their geological expeditions. After her father's death, she'd only seen him a couple of times at memorial gatherings. A retired notary. What could he possibly know? What key did he have? She couldn't sleep that night. She sat clutching the little note like it was the only solid thing left in her shattered world. By dawn, as the gray light crept through the window, she made a decision. Things couldn't get any worse. She found her father's old address book and the faded phone number inside. Her fingers dialed it. After several long rings, a sleepy, elderly voice answered. Hello? Sebastian? Her own voice sounded foreign. This is Agnes Stafford, Igor Stafford's daughter. There was a pause. Then the man's voice warmed. Agnes, of course I remember you, dear. Did something happen? They arranged to meet at 11 in his office, where he still handled some papers. Sebastian Howell's office was on the first floor of an old brick building in downtown Portland, behind a massive door with cracked varnish. Inside smelled of old paper, wax, and strong tea. He hadn't changed much, still tall and thin, with a mane of pure white hair and deep-set, piercing eyes. He wore a neat, slightly worn suit jacket. He seated her in a deep leather chair that creaked like it was alive and placed a steaming cup of tea before her. I heard about yesterday, he said quietly, without preamble, looking off to the side. It's a small town, Agnes. News travels fast. I'm very sorry. Your father would never have allowed that. There was no curiosity in his tone, only sincere, heavy sadness. Agnes felt the lump in her throat, the one she'd been holding back since last night, begin to melt. They've always been like that, she said hoarsely. But yesterday they made it public. Sebastian nodded, asking no further questions. You said you needed to talk to me, he said softly. Instead of answering, she silently reached into her bag, took out her father's note, and handed it to him. He put on a pair of thin metal-framed glasses and held the sheet delicately between his long, bony fingers. As he read, his face showed no emotion. But then he looked up, and Agnes saw his expression change. The sympathy and sadness vanished. In their place appeared sharp focus and concern. No, something else. Urgency. All right, he said quietly, as if giving himself an order. So, the time has come. He stood, walked to a massive fireproof cabinet that took up almost the entire wall, and spent a while turning the combination dial. With a heavy sigh, the door swung open. From the very back, he pulled out a thick ledger bound in dark leather, the gold lettering on its cover nearly worn away by time. He laid it on the table before Agnes, and the air filled with the musty smell of decades. His hands trembled slightly as he opened the heavy cover. Your father wasn't just a geologist, Agnes, he said softly. He was a genius, and he loved you very, very much. He saw everything happening in your family. He knew that after his death, things wouldn't be easy for you, so he prepared. Sebastian flipped through several dense pages covered in fine handwriting and stopped at one marked Stafford, Land Plot No. 17, Spring Creek Association. Many years ago, back in the 80s, during one of his expeditions, your father conducted some unofficial research on that very plot where the cottage now stands. He told no one, filed it as a routine geological survey for the local garden association. But what he discovered was extraordinary. He paused, glancing at Agnes over the top of his glasses. At a depth of about 400 feet beneath that land lies a unique aquifer, a natural underground source of pure artesian water with an exceptional mineral composition. There's nothing else like it in our entire state. He realized that instantly. But he also knew that if the truth came out, the land would be taken from him. Or your brother would squander it. Agnes listened, holding her breath. It sounded like something out of a novel, not her own life. So he began a long, complex legal game, Sebastian went on, and now there was admiration in his voice. He spent nearly 10 years on it, going through bureaucracies, collecting permits, registering data, patenting the water's composition. He went through every circle of bureaucratic hell. But in the end, he succeeded. He secured exclusive extraction rights for the water from that source, and, most importantly, he didn't attach those rights to his own name, but to the land itself, to the deed for that cottage. The rights transfer automatically with the property. Whoever owns the cottage owns the spring. Your mother didn't know. Daniel, even less. Your father did it in secret, for you. That was your real inheritance. Agnes felt dizzy. A wreck, dirt, weeds, and beneath them, treasure. He left this ledger with me for safekeeping and made me swear to hand it over only if you came to me with his note. He said, she'll come when she's ready, when life corners her enough to make her act, not endure. Looks like he was right. Sebastian sighed heavily and turned another page. But there's one problem, Agnes. A serious one. He tapped a line in the document. According to the law back then, rights like these were granted for a limited term. If the resource wasn't developed during that time, the rights expired and reverted to the state. Your father secured the longest extension possible, but even that isn't forever. The license expires in 6 months. 6 months. She had only half a year to do something, but what? What could a logistics manager possibly do with an underground water source? And that's not all, Sebastian added quietly, almost in a whisper. There's another side to this. About 5 years ago, a major multinational beverage corporation entered our state. They've been building plants across the country, and they have a standing commercial offer filed with the Regional Chamber of Commerce. They're willing to pay millions for any verified rights to a water source with the right mineral composition. I checked 2 years ago, just out of curiosity. Their offer is still active. He looked straight into her eyes. His gaze was heavy and meaningful. That cottage your mother threw at you like a bone? It's not worthless, Agnes. It's a gold mine. The air in his office felt thick and heavy. Agnes stared at the old ledger, at the faded ink, unable to fully process what she'd just heard. A gold mine. Those words didn't fit the image of the sagging shack and the overgrown nettles. But the notary's eyes were dead serious. No hint of doubt. The numbness slowly gave way, not to joy or excitement, but to something colder and stronger. A hard, steel-like resolve. Her father hadn't just left her money. He'd left her a weapon. And instructions on how to use it. And she would. Not for revenge, for freedom. What do I need to do? She asked. Her voice was calm, steady. Sebastian seemed to have been waiting for that. He closed the heavy book, as if locking the secret away again. First, not a word to anyone. Not your mother, not your brother, not a single soul. They can't know until it's done. Second, you'll need a good lawyer. Not a local one. I'll give you a number, a man in New York who specializes in these kinds of cases. Expensive, but trustworthy. The son of an old friend. He'll understand. When Agnes stepped out into the sunlit street, for the first time in years she felt she could breathe freely. People hurried about their lives, cars honked, the city moved as usual, but for her, everything had changed. She was walking the same streets, but seeing them differently. She was no longer a victim. She was someone with a plan. That same day, she called the number Sebastian had given her. The voice on the other end sounded professional, a bit tired. She introduced herself, said she was calling on Sebastian Howell's recommendation about mineral rights. The fatigue in his voice vanished instantly. He scheduled a meeting in New York for 2 days later. She took 2 days off work, claiming a family emergency. Her boss frowned but said nothing. No one asked questions. Her life had never interested anyone. The lawyer's name was Arnold Baker. His office, on the 25th floor of a gleaming Manhattan tower, was the complete opposite of Sebastian's dusty study, glass and steel, panoramic views. Arnold himself, a man in his 50s with a flawless suit, greeted her politely but with cautious skepticism. He listened, reviewed the copies of the documents Sebastian had given her. As he read, his skepticism shifted to genuine interest, then professional excitement. "Incredible," he said finally, setting the papers down. "A real time capsule. I've heard legends about dormant licenses like this, but I've never seen one in person. The corporation Sebastian mentioned, they're hunting for sites like this. If the data checks out, they'll bite hard." After that, everything moved at lightning speed. Agnes operated like a finely tuned machine, just as she always had at work, only now she was working for herself. Following Arnold's instructions, she opened an account at a private bank she'd never even heard of. She signed a contract granting him full authority to negotiate on her behalf. She became a shadow, a ghost existing only on paper. The corporation's response came the very next day. Just as Arnold predicted, they were thrilled. They'd been tracking archives for years, trying to trace the property, but it had always been listed as ordinary garden land with no special rights. They'd assumed the documents were lost long ago. The news that the rights existed, and had a legitimate owner, was a bombshell. They rushed everything, verification, testing, bureaucracy, all cleared in record time. A week later, a full team arrived at the old cottage. Several trucks loaded with drilling equipment and a mobile lab looked absurd beside the rotting fence and collapsing shack, like a spaceship landing on a junkyard. Agnes watched from a distance, sitting in Arnold's car. He'd flown in from New York to be there in person. She stared as the engineers in hard hats set up their gear on the same patch of land where, as a child, she and her father had once tried planting potatoes, the land her mother always called dead and useless. After a few hours, the lead geologist walked over to the car, took off his helmet, wiped the sweat from his forehead, and smiled. "It's all confirmed," he said, nodding to Arnold. "Even better than the old reports. Yields higher, mineralization perfect. It's a jackpot." 2 weeks later, in the quiet of a private bank office, Agnes signed the final documents, the sale of the rights and the land itself. She no longer owned the shabby cottage in Spring Creek. A moment later, her phone buzzed with a text notification. She opened it. The number on the screen was so long, with so many zeros, her mind refused to process it. It wasn't just money. It was a ticket to another life. A one-way ticket. For the next 2 weeks, she lived as if in a dream. She went to work, did her job, drank coffee with her coworkers. No one had any idea that the woman sitting among them had just become unimaginably wealthy. On the last day of the month, she placed a resignation letter on her boss's desk. He raised his eyebrows in surprise. "Where are you going? Got a better offer?" "I'm just leaving," Agnes said calmly. "I need a break." She worked the required 2 weeks. On her last day, she left her office badge on the desk, said goodbye to her coworkers, who looked at her in confusion, and walked out of the office where she'd spent 15 years, without regret. At home, she opened her closet. Her whole life, she'd been saving things, setting them aside for a rainy day. Now she understood, all of it was just ballast, anchors that had kept her stuck in place. She took out a large suitcase, the same one she'd once dreamed of taking on a seaside vacation. She packed a few clothes, her documents, a small photo album with pictures of her father, and that sheet of notebook paper with his handwriting. Everything else she left behind, the apartment, the furniture, the dishes, the past. Online, she paid off the rest of her mortgage in one single payment. Then she bought a train ticket, not to New York, but to another city, far away, on the West Coast, where no one knew her. A sleeper car ticket, first class. She had never allowed herself such luxury before. On the day of departure, Arnold came to the station to see her off. He handed her the last folder with the documents and statements. "Good luck, Agnes," he said, shaking her hand firmly. "Your father would be proud of you." She stood on the platform, breathing in the scent of creosote and distant travel. Boarding was announced. She was about to step onto the train when, out of the corner of her eye, she noticed a familiar figure on the platform, her cousin Nellie. The same Nellie whose eyes had burned with malice at that birthday party. Nellie had been meeting or seeing someone off, but now she froze in place, staring straight at Agnes. Agnes saw her cousin's gaze slide over her calm face, her expensive suitcase, Arnold's impeccable suit beside her, and finally land on the number of her car, a luxury sleeper. At first, Nellie's eyes widened in surprise, then narrowed in disbelief. And finally, that same spark of greedy curiosity and dark envy lit up in them. Agnes didn't look back. She felt Nellie's burning gaze on her back but didn't react. She simply stepped into the car, and the conductor closed the door behind her, shutting out the platform, the old life, and her cousin's envious eyes. The train started moving smoothly, without a jolt, carrying her farther and farther from the city that had been her prison for 40 years. A year passed. A year in which Agnes changed more than she had in the previous 20. She now lived in a big, bustling city, Seattle, where no one cared who she was. And that was the greatest gift. She bought a spacious, bright apartment in a new building with windows overlooking the bay. She furnished it simply but tastefully, not chasing luxury, just seeking the comfort she'd never had. Silence. That was her greatest treasure. In the mornings, she drank coffee while watching the slow flow of the water, and no one barged in with reproaches or demands. She walked a lot, read books, went to the theater. She simply lived. The money didn't sit idle. Following Arnold's advice, she handled it wisely. Part of it was on deposit, generating a steady income. The rest, the larger part, she invested. Fate introduced her to a man named Victor Carson. He was the developer whose company had ultimately bought the land from the Beverage Corporation to build a logistics hub and access roads for their new plant. Victor, a 45-year-old man with an open, honest gaze and a firm handshake, was the complete opposite of her brother. He had built his business from scratch and valued integrity and practical intelligence. When Arnold arranged their meeting, Victor wasn't just impressed by Agnes's story, it was her deep understanding of logistics that caught his attention. She, a former manager at a food company, explained to him in simple, clear terms how to optimize transport flows for his new project. She became his silent partner. She invested part of her capital in one of his developments, and her share was already yielding steady profits. They met once a week at his office to discuss business. He admired her sharp mind and calm confidence. She respected his reliability and honesty. She rarely thought about her old family. Sometimes, late at night, her mother's laughing face or her brother's sneering grin would flash in her mind, but those images no longer hurt. They were like old photos of strangers she didn't care to remember. She cut all ties, changed her phone number, deleted her social media accounts. She disappeared. Meanwhile, back in her hometown of Portland, life, at least according to Evelyn Stafford, was thriving. She had blossomed. Every trip to the store or post office became a little performance. "Oh, Mrs. Peterson. Hello." She'd call across the yard. "How are you?" "We're doing just wonderful. My Daniel's business is international now." Evelyn lied beautifully. She told anyone who would listen that her brilliant son had finally found his calling. He was in import-export, bringing in exclusive goods from abroad. According to her, the money was pouring in. And at first, it almost looked true. Daniel had indeed sold the apartment his mother gave him for his birthday, sold it fast, without haggling, and walked away with a nice sum. With that money, he started fresh. He bought a luxury car, updated his wardrobe, and became a regular at the city's finest restaurants. He even had a new friend, a man named Glenn. Charismatic, charming, with a dazzling smile and an expensive watch, he claimed to have vast international connections. He was, supposedly, the brain behind their new import-export venture. Daniel was dazzled. He believed Glenn's every word, invested in all his ideas, signed papers without reading them. He felt on top of the world. As for the missing sister, Evelyn spoke of her with disgusted pity. "Agnes?" She'd sneer. "Who knows? She ran off. Ungrateful girl. I gave her everything, and she just vanished without even leaving an address. They say she ran off with some man, must have been some slick talker who turned her head. Shameful, really." Cousin Nellie eagerly supported this version. She became Evelyn's closest confidant, dropping by with cakes, listening for hours to her bragging about Daniel, and chiming in on conversations about Agnes. And one evening, while Evelyn was once again telling how Daniel would soon buy her a villa by the sea, Nellie added a casual but poisonous comment. "You know, Evelyn," she began sweetly, stirring her tea, "I actually saw her. The day she disappeared. At the train station." Evelyn stopped mid-sentence. "You saw her? And?" "Well, it was strange. She wasn't alone. There was a man with her, well-dressed, very respectable looking. He was seeing her off. And she didn't board an ordinary coach, it was a sleeper, the expensive kind. She had a brand new suitcase, looked calm, confident like she wasn't running away but leaving on some very important business. Nellie paused, letting the words sink in. I couldn't help but think she looked like someone leaving with something valuable. Evelyn snorted. Valuable? What could she possibly have taken? My old pots from the cottage. Don't be ridiculous, Nellie. She probably ran off with some sugar daddy who bought her that ticket. Now she's probably rotting in some rundown apartment, regretting it. But the seed of doubt had been planted. Something about Nellie's story gnawed at Evelyn. Calm, confident, first class. Why? Still, thoughts of Agnes were soon pushed aside by new joys. Daniel announced that he and Glenn were preparing the deal of the century. They just needed one last major investment, a bank loan. A big one. Daniel couldn't take it himself, he already had several small consumer loans hanging over him. So he came to his mother. She didn't hesitate for a second. Her son was a genius. He just needed support. She went with him to the bank. Her good credit history, her apartment as collateral, all that opened the doors for them. The manager smiled politely. Daniel threw around words like logistics, freight, customs clearance. Evelyn sat beside him, prouder than ever, signing the guarantor's paperwork without even reading it closely. She was sure she was investing in her son's brilliant future. For the first few months, everything seemed fine. Daniel made payments on time, lived lavishly, and promised his mother riches beyond imagination. Evelyn was over the moon. Then Daniel stopped answering calls. At first, he blamed business issues, customs delays, promised it would all be fine. Then his phone went dead altogether. Evelyn began to worry, but pushed the bad thoughts away. One evening, she fetched her mail as usual, newspapers, flyers, and a thick white envelope with the logo of that same bank. She opened it casually, thinking it was another ad. Inside was an official letter, formal typeface, cold wording. And then she saw the words that made her vision blur. Notice of overdue debt. Breach of loan agreement. Final demand for payment. Her eyes ran over the lines, struggling to grasp their meaning, until they stopped on a number. The total debt, with interest and penalties, had ballooned into an astronomical sum. And the last line, in bold. Pursuant to Clause 4.5 of the guarantor agreement, in case of borrower default, the bank reserves the right to demand full repayment from the guarantor. The paper slipped from her trembling fingers and floated onto the carpet. The page was cold, indifferent. Evelyn read it again and again, but the meaning wouldn't stick. It dissolved into panic. The six-figure debt danced before her eyes. Guarantor. Full repayment. She sank into a chair, feeling the icy chill rise from her legs to her chest. Her life savings, every penny she'd set aside from her pension, were nothing compared to that amount. Her apartment, the one she'd lived in for 30 years, furnished piece by piece, where she'd raised her children, was the collateral. Her hands shaking, she grabbed the phone and searched for her son's number. The subscriber's phone is switched off or out of service. She called again, and again. The mechanical voice sounded more sinister each time. She called every hospital, every morgue. He wasn't anywhere. Fear turned into icy rage. Where was he? Where had he gone with her money? With her life? At that very moment, Daniel was standing in the parking lot of his upscale apartment complex, helplessly watching as a tow truck hooked his gleaming black luxury car, his proudest symbol of success. Two men in suits stood nearby, faces expressionless. One of them, a court officer, had just read him the official order of property seizure. "You can't do this," Daniel shouted, feeling the eyes of curious neighbors watching from their windows. "This is a mistake. I'll fix it. All inquiries can be directed to the bailiff's office," the officer replied tonelessly, jotting notes in his paperwork. "The vehicle will be impounded until the debt is settled." Daniel rushed to find his friend and business partner, Glenn. But his luxury rental apartment was empty. The concierge said the tenant had moved out the morning before, hurriedly loading 2 suitcases into a taxi. Glenn's phone number, of course, was disconnected. Daniel's world, built on easy money and empty boasting, collapsed like a house of cards. The business was a sham. Glenn, a con artist. He'd found an arrogant, greedy Daniel the perfect mark and vanished, taking every last cent, the apartment money, the massive bank loan, everything. Daniel didn't even have enough for a cab. Humiliated and broken, he rode the city bus to his mother's apartment for the first time in a year. All the way there, he rehearsed what to say. He needed money fast. He had to borrow more, sell something, cover the hole. Then, he told himself, he could still fix everything. He wasn't a fraud, just unlucky. And his mother would help him. She always had. He burst into her apartment without even greeting her. "Mom, I need money. Right now," he blurted out from the doorway. "It's serious, I'll explain later. I need a lot. Immediately." Evelyn sat hunched in an armchair, a frail shadow in the dim light. She looked at him silently, her eyes hollow. Then, slowly, as if lifting something unbearably heavy, she raised her hand and handed him a folded bank notice. Daniel snatched the paper impatiently and unfolded it. As he read, his expression shifted, arrogance fading first to confusion, then to fear. The same raw, animal fear his mother felt at that very moment. This has to be a mistake," he stammered, sinking onto the couch. "They can't. Glenn said the payments were going through." "Glenn's gone," Evelyn said, her voice quiet but cold as steel. "His phone's off. Your car, where is it?" "Seized," he muttered. Silence filled the room like smoke. "They'll take my apartment," Evelyn said, staring at the wall. "They'll take my pension. All the savings I put aside for my funeral will go toward your debt. I'll be on the street. At 70. Because of you." Daniel jumped up. Fear turned to anger, that spoiled, defensive fury of a child caught lying. "Because of me?" he yelled. "Who always backed me up? Who kept saying I was a genius? You wanted this. You wanted to brag to your friends about your successful son. I wanted my son to be okay." She screamed, her voice breaking. "I believed you. I gave you everything. I signed that cursed paper because you're my son. And what did you do? You threw it all away, on that swindler, on restaurants, on clothes. You're nothing, Daniel. Nothing." Words she'd never dared to say, maybe never even thought before, came pouring out. The dam burst. 40 years of blind, worshipful love curdled into something fierce and poisonous. "This is all your fault," he shouted, jabbing a finger at her, his face twisted with rage. "You were never satisfied. You always compared me to her, to Agnes. I was never good enough. You made me this way. You gave me that apartment and then threw it in my face. You should have given me more, right away. Then I wouldn't have had to deal with Glenn at all." "More?" she gasped, shaking with fury and despair. "From where? We had nothing. Nothing but this apartment and my pension." And then Daniel, desperate to land one last blow, to prove he was right, shouted the words that destroyed everything. "Nothing? What about the apartment you gave me? The one I sold? That was our only real asset, Mom. The only thing we had, besides this dump you used as collateral. There's nothing left. There never was." The words hung in the air like poison. "There's nothing left. There never was." He said it, and even he flinched at the finality of it. He looked at his mother's face, frozen in horror, and felt no pity. Only anger. Anger at her, at Glenn, at the whole world that had collapsed overnight. He turned, slammed the door so hard the dishes rattled in the cabinet, and stormed out. Where to go? What to do? A few crumpled bills in his pocket, enough for maybe 2 days. His legs carried him automatically downtown, to Versailles, the same upscale restaurant where, just a week earlier, he'd been throwing money around, where waiters bowed and the manager shook his hand. It was the last place where he'd still felt like somebody. He sat at his usual table by the window, ordered the most expensive cognac, and downed it in one gulp. Then another, and another. The alcohol didn't dull the pain, it only fueled his rage and self-pity. When the check arrived, he handed the waiter his gold credit card, his sacred badge of success. The waiter returned a few minutes later, looking uncomfortable. "Mr. Stafford, I'm sorry, the card was declined." "What do you mean, declined?" Daniel barked, drawing stares from nearby tables. "Run it again. Your machine's broken." "We tried 3 times, sir. Transaction denied. Insufficient funds." It hit him like a slap, a public one. Daniel Stafford, successful businessman, couldn't pay his restaurant bill. He looked around. At the next table sat Marina Wallace and her husband, one of his mother's old friends, staring at him with open curiosity. Farther away, his uncle and aunt were whispering to each other. It felt like the entire city was there, watching his humiliation. "How dare you?" he shouted, jumping to his feet. The cognac had burned away the last of his restraint. "Do you know who I am?" The manager approached quietly but firmly. "Please, sir, calm down. Let's resolve this peacefully. You're the one causing a scene." Daniel snapped, his voice rising to a shrill pitch. "This is all her fault, my sister's. The thief. She stole everything. The diners stopped eating and turned toward him. The show had begun. She robbed us, Daniel shouted, gesturing wildly. At the cottage, the old one, there were family jewels hidden there, my great-grandmother's. She knew where they were. She took everything before running off with her lover. I'm broke because of her. She ruined my life. And you're worried about a damn credit card? It was drunken nonsense, invented on the spot, an attempt to shift blame and humiliation onto someone else. And distant, silent Agnes was the perfect target. She couldn't answer, couldn't defend herself. The scene ended with security being called. Daniel, cursing and shouting, was escorted out under a storm of pitying and contemptuous looks. By the next morning, the whole town was buzzing. Evelyn's phone wouldn't stop ringing, but she didn't pick up. She knew what was waiting on the other end, not comfort, but greedy curiosity disguised as sympathy. The story of Daniel's drunken outburst spread instantly, gaining colorful embellishments with every retelling. Marina Wallace called every mutual acquaintance, vividly describing how poor Daniel Stafford had gone off the deep end, yelling about some thief of a sister. For Evelyn, it was the end. Her world, built on lies about her brilliant son, had turned to dust. She drew the curtains, unplugged the doorbell, and sat in the dark for days, staring into nothing. The humiliation was absolute. The same people she'd once looked down on now pitied her, and that pity was unbearable. Daniel came home at dawn, bruised and sober but not remorseful. They sat in separate rooms, like two spiders in one jar, hating each other, yet bound by shared ruin and fear. They were cornered, crushed by debt, stripped of reputation, staring into emptiness. And then, at their lowest point, Evelyn's phone rang. The caller ID showed a familiar number, Nellie. Evelyn wanted to ignore it, but her hand pressed answer on its own. Aunt Evelyn, hi, it's me, came her niece's smooth, sympathetic voice. Hope I'm not disturbing you. I heard what happened. Awful, just awful. I've been so worried about you and Daniel. Evelyn said nothing. Aunt Evelyn, I'm calling for a reason, Nellie went on quickly, sensing she had her attention. I didn't believe those rumors about Agnes, about the jewelry, I mean. But her departure, it really was strange. And I started thinking, remember that old cottage? Evelyn tensed. I checked something, just out of curiosity. In public records. That land, it's not yours anymore. It's been sold. And there's a huge construction site there now. Mother and son exchanged glances. And in their eyes, the same spark flashed at once, wild, desperate realization. I did some digging. Nellie's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. Do you know who the developer is? I found the name of the man whose company owns it all now. The man who bought your worthless land. His name is Victor Carson. Victor Carson. The name hit the silence of the stale apartment like a gunshot. For a moment, the hatred that had poisoned them for the past 24 hours vanished, replaced by a wild, desperate hope, the hope that they had found the real culprit. Not themselves. Not Glenn the con artist. Someone else. Give me that, Daniel snapped, grabbing the phone from his mother's hand while it was still connected to Nellie. How do you spell it? Carson? Say it letter by letter. Nellie dictated it, and Daniel, already hunched over their old laptop, started typing the name with trembling fingers. Evelyn stood behind him, breathing down his neck. The first link led to the official website of Carson Development, a major construction holding. Sleek design, glossy skyscraper photos, smiling workers. Daniel clicked feverishly through the sections, about us, our projects, until he froze. There, under regional investments, was the name of their city. He clicked the link. The page loaded with a bold headline. Construction of a high-tech bottling plant, Living Spring. They stared at the screen. In the drone-shot photos, the overgrown patch of land, their old plot, the place where that rotten shack had once stood, had become a vast construction site. Dozens of machines, cranes, dump trucks, bulldozers, crawled across the ground like giant yellow insects. Massive buildings of concrete and glass were already rising from the dirt. That's our cottage, Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible. Daniel kept scrolling down, his jaw tight. The Press About Us section caught his eye. He clicked a headline from the local business paper. Carson Development invests millions in unique local water source. They read the article together, the icy grip of fear tightening with every line. It spoke of a unique geological discovery, an underground aquifer with rare mineral properties. A multi-million-dollar deal for extraction rights. A future plant that would provide hundreds of jobs and become a flagship of the regional food industry. Millions. Unique source. Multi-million-dollar deal. The words crashed against their minds like waves against a cliff. They looked at each other, and in that moment, the horrifying truth hit them with brutal clarity. It wasn't about great-grandmother's brooches. It wasn't about gold coins under the floorboards. Agnes hadn't stumbled upon some petty treasure. She had sold the land itself, that useless, filthy, dead patch they'd thrown at her like a bone. And it was worth a fortune. She knew. Evelyn rasped. Her face turned ashen gray. She knew everything. Images flickered in her mind like pieces of a broken film reel. The dusty folder. Agnes's calm, unreadable face at the birthday dinner. Her silent exit. Nellie's story. The man in the elegant suit. The luxury sleeper car. It all fit together now, into one grotesque, mocking picture. They'd been duped. Their own daughter and sister, quiet, invisible Agnes, the one they'd dismissed her entire life, had pulled off the deal of the century right under their noses. She hadn't just run away. She had run away with their money. That's what they believed. Their minds simply couldn't grasp that it might rightfully belong to her. They'd given her trash, and she had turned it into gold. Thief! Evelyn screamed, her voice shaking the air. The fury in it was something Daniel had never heard before, the rage of a gambler who'd lost everything, the rage of a person humiliated by their own weapon, contempt. She robbed us. She knew and stayed silent, on purpose, to laugh at us. All the self-pity, all the fear of the bank, burned away, feeding one blazing inferno of hatred. Hatred for Agnes. She was to blame for everything. Not Daniel's incompetence. Not Evelyn's blindness. Agnes's cunning, that was the reason for their ruin. The thought was comforting. It gave them a villain to hate, an outlet for their rage. "We'll find her," Daniel said, leaping to his feet, his eyes feverish. Despair had turned into the manic energy of a hunter who'd caught a scent. "We'll make her give the money back. Half of it's ours by law. She had no right to sell without our consent." He didn't know a single legal fact, but it didn't matter. What mattered was the illusion that justice was on their side. She must be found. Immediately, Evelyn echoed. She rushed to the old dresser, rummaging through the drawers, tossing yellowed receipts and postcards onto the floor. Finally, at the bottom of a jewelry box, she found an old address book. Here. Her old cell number. The one she hasn't changed in years. Evelyn dialed. Long, hopeless rings. Then, a click, followed by a cold automated voice. "The number you are trying to reach is temporarily unavailable." She hurled the phone onto the couch so hard it bounced and hit the wall. A dead end. They knew the truth, but couldn't reach the one they blamed. They sat in silence, hollowed out, crushed. Then Evelyn lifted her head, and her eyes flashed a last, desperate idea. "Tamara," she whispered. "From Spokane. The cousin." Daniel frowned. "Who's Tamara?" "Agnes used to message her sometimes. On Facebook. I saw it. She'd look at her page, photos of her grandkids. It's the only thread left. The only one." Daniel grabbed the laptop again. They found the profile, an older woman with kind eyes, surrounded by children and flowers. Pushing her son aside, Evelyn sat down and began to type. Her fingers, clumsy from years of punching buttons on an old flip phone, pecked at the keys awkwardly. She opened the private messages. She didn't know if Agnes would ever read it, or when. But this was her last chance. She paused for a moment, choosing her words carefully. Not threats. Not accusations. She had to play the grieving mother. To strike at the heart, not the mind. She began typing, pouring all her hatred into words coated with false despair. "My daughter. My dearest, please, answer me. Something terrible has happened. Save your brother. He's out on the street." The message arrived late at night. Agnes rarely checked Facebook, maybe once every couple of months, mostly to see new photos of her cousin Tamara's grandchildren, her one fragile link to a past not poisoned by cruelty. She was scrolling through pictures of a smiling baby in a bonnet when the notification icon blinked. She opened the message without thinking, and her mother's words hit her like a blast of icy air on a warm day. "My daughter. My dearest, please, answer me. Something terrible has happened. Save your brother. He's out on the street." Agnes stared at the screen. She felt no pity, no sympathy. A whole year of silence, a year in which they hadn't once tried to find her, hadn't asked if she was even alive. And now, "my dearest daughter." The falseness of those words was almost tangible. She didn't feel pain, only a faint disgust, like tasting something spoiled. Something had happened. Something serious enough to make them remember she existed. And whatever it was, she was certain it involved money. She didn't reply. She simply closed the laptop and went to make tea. Her hands were steady. Her heartbeat calm. A year of freedom had taught her one thing: never to let their poison back into her veins. Still, all night she couldn't shake one thought. What were they up to now? What new act of their family drama was about to begin? The next day, she had a scheduled meeting with Victor Carson at his office. They were reviewing budgets for a new project when he noticed her distracted expression and set the papers aside. "Agnes, is something wrong? You seem distant today." Over the past year, Victor had become more than just a business partner. He was the only person in the city she truly trusted. He knew the outline of her story, that she'd left her hometown and cut ties with her family, but she'd never shared the ugly details. Agnes silently unlocked her phone, opened the screenshot of the message, and handed it to him. Victor read it, his thick brows drawing together. "Save your brother. Sounds like manipulation." "That's exactly what it is," Agnes said evenly. "My whole life with them was manipulation. I just didn't see it before." Then she told him calmly, without tears or drama, as if giving a report, about the 40th birthday, the apartment and the cottage. Her brother's shout, "Your place is in the dirt." Her mother's laughter. Her father's note. The old notary. The deal. Her departure. Victor listened in silence, his expression growing graver with each word. He was a builder, a man of action, and he despised two things: deceit and family feuds that poisoned everything around them. Her story had both. "So they don't know how much you made, but they suspect it was a lot," he said finally. "And now that they're in trouble, they think you're their lifeline, or more likely, their bank account." "Something like that," Agnes nodded. "My mother wrote that Daniel's on the street. A year ago, she was bragging to the whole family that he'd started some fancy import-export business. She said it casually, as just another fact. But when she mentioned her brother's name, something flickered in Victor's face. He frowned, as if trying to grasp a half-formed thought. "What did you say his name was?" he asked quietly. "Daniel Stafford," Agnes replied. "Stafford," Victor repeated thoughtfully. "From Portland." He suddenly turned to his large monitor, pushing the blueprints aside and opening an internal company program, not the internet, but their corporate security system. He entered a password and began typing quickly into the search bar. "What is it?" Agnes asked. "We have a security division," Victor explained without looking up. "Whenever we enter a new region with major investments, they compile reports about everything: corrupt officials, criminal networks, local con artists who might try to latch onto the project. So we know who not to deal with." He clicked the mouse. A document opened, marked for internal use only. His eyes scanned the screen, and his expression hardened to stone. "I knew it," he said grimly. He turned the monitor toward Agnes. It was a report on a regional fraud network, risk group. A list of names, photos, and short descriptions of their methods. And there he was. A man with a predatory yet charming smile and an expensive watch gleaming on his wrist. Beneath the photo, Glenn Osborne, A.K.A. Glenn Morrison, Ian Matthews. Below was a description of his activities. Specializes in creating shell companies under the guise of high-yield international deals. Gains the victim's trust by exploiting vanity and greed. Persuades them to take out large loans using real estate as collateral. Disappears once the funds are secured. But the most important line was the last one. Osborne targets individuals with sudden access to easy money, recent inheritances, or lottery winnings. Ideal victims are arrogant, overconfident in their genius, and dismissive of financial prudence. They never ask too many questions. Victor sat in silence, letting her read and absorb it. "Our security team blacklisted him 3 months ago, just as he started showing up in town," Victor said quietly. "Your brother, Agnes, he wasn't just unlucky. He was the textbook example of that kind of mark. Not a victim of circumstance, the inevitable outcome." Agnes stared at the slick conman's photo and the description of his ideal prey. It was her brother's portrait, painted by a stranger with the precision of a psychologist. Something clicked inside her. The last remnants of doubt, those microscopic grains of childish belief that somewhere deep down her mother and brother were just lost, unhappy people, evaporated. They weren't lost. They were predators. Small, foolish ones, but predators nonetheless. And when a bigger, smarter predator devoured one of them, they'd crawl to her, hoping to bite off a piece to heal their own wounds. For the first time in her life, she saw the situation not as a victim, but as a strategist. She was on the mountain, and they were in the pit. They were reaching up, expecting her to come down. But she had no intention of descending. She would make them climb, just so they could see how high she stood before tumbling back down. "Thank you, Victor," she said, her voice calm and steady, like a lake on a windless day. "Now I know what to do." Back home, Agnes sat at her laptop. She looked at her mother's desperate message for a long moment. Then her fingers settled lightly on the keyboard, and she typed her reply, short, cold, simple. "I heard there were some problems. What happened?" She hit send and went to put on the kettle. She knew she wouldn't have to wait long. The phone rang before the water even boiled. The number was unfamiliar, but she knew exactly who it was. "Hello," she said evenly. "Sweetheart. Agnes. My darling girl." Her mother's voice on the other end was thick with tears, hysteria, and bad theater. "Did you get it? Did you read it? Oh, thank God, I prayed you'd answer." Agnes said nothing, letting her talk. "We're in trouble, sweetheart, terrible trouble." Evelyn sobbed into the receiver. "Daniel, our boy, he's lost everything. Evil people tricked him, cheated him. He's been destroyed, Agnes. He doesn't eat, doesn't sleep, he's just a shadow. I'm afraid he'll hurt himself, he's so sensitive, so fragile." "Arrogant, overconfident in his genius," echoed the voice from Victor's report in Agnes's mind. "We have to stick together, Agnes," her mother went on. "Family is everything. Blood is thicker than water. Forgive us if we were wrong. Pride is a sin. We need to help Daniel, pull him out of this. You're his sister, his only hope." The performance was designed to stir guilt, a script that had always worked before. But not this time. Agnes listened the way one listens to rain tapping against the window, detached, indifferent. "I'm begging you," her mother's voice dropped to a trembling whisper, thick with false pleading. "Let's meet. Just talk. Face to face. We have to discuss everything. Please, my daughter." There it was, the moment Agnes had been waiting for. "All right," she said. "Just all right." There was a stunned pause. Her mother had clearly prepared for a long emotional battle, not instant agreement. Then Evelyn's surprise melted into a flood of theatrical gratitude. "Oh, thank you, sweetheart. I knew you had a kind heart. I knew it. Where's good for you? When? We'll go anywhere." That was when Agnes took control. "Next Saturday," she said in a calm, commanding tone that made her mother fall silent. 7 p.m. in my hometown, at the restaurant La Verita. Silence again. La Verita, the truth, had opened 6 months earlier and instantly became Portland's most exclusive, expensive, and talked about restaurant. A place ordinary people could only admire from the sidewalk. Dinner there cost as much as a month's salary. Evelyn and Daniel had heard of it, of course, but never set foot inside. "But that's very expensive," Evelyn stammered, torn between greed and shock. "I'm paying," Agnes said curtly. "Be on time." She hung up without waiting for a response. In the apartment across town, Evelyn slowly lowered the phone. The tears vanished instantly. She looked at Daniel, who'd been listening eagerly the whole time. "She agreed," she said. "I heard," he grinned. "At La Verita, huh? Trying to show off, flaunt her fancy new life. Idiot. Good. That means she's got money and she's not hiding it. She wants to humiliate us," Evelyn hissed. "Let her," Daniel shrugged. "Let her feed her ego. We'll play along. Cry a little, apologize. Then hit her with the demand, half of everything she made. The cottage is ours by law. Not a cent less. She's walking straight into our trap." They were already dividing the spoils, convinced Agnes was still the same timid gray mouse, just dressed up in peacock feathers. They didn't see the trap, only the bait. Agnes stood by the panoramic window of her apartment, looking out at the city lights. She held her phone loosely in one hand. There was no smile on her face, only intense focus, like a chess player before a decisive move. Then she made another call. "Hello, Francois? Good evening," she said in flawless French. "This is Agnes Stafford. Yes, everything's confirmed. For Saturday. Table number 1, center of the hall. Yes, for my guests. Make sure the service is impeccable. They must feel special." She hung up. Francois was the maitre d' she had personally brought over from New York for her new venture, the restaurant La Verita. Agnes didn't just have a table reserved there. She was the restaurant's main, and completely anonymous, investor. She didn't waste time. The next few days turned into non-stop preparation for a battle her opponents didn't even know was coming. Her first call was to Sebastian Howell. "Sebastian, hello. It's Agnes. I need your help. And your presence." It wasn't a request, it was a statement. The old notary on the other end didn't sound the least bit surprised. "I've been expecting your call, my dear," he said calmly. Since the day you left. What should I bring? The original copy of my father's will, she replied. The full version, with all attachments and amendments you've been keeping. It's always ready, he said calmly. When should I arrive? Agnes booked him a plane ticket for the next available flight. She arranged a taxi to and from the airport, making sure every detail of the elderly man's journey was as comfortable as possible. He was the keeper of her father's final will, and she treated him with profound respect. He was her only ally left from the past. Her second call was to Victor. Victor, I need some information, she said without preamble. Everything about my brother's case, the name of the scammer, how the scheme worked, the loan amount, the bank that issued it. Anything your security team can find. That's not a problem, he replied, matching her businesslike tone. What's this for? I want your lawyers to contact other small business owners in my hometown, anyone else who might have been scammed by this Glenn Osborne. My brother can't be his only victim. Victor paused for a moment, then his voice carried a note of respect. I see. You want to create a precedent, unite the victims. Smart move. My people will start immediately. Consider the hornet's nest stirred. And they did. The Carson Development Legal Department kicked into gear like a well-oiled machine. They made calls through their network, reached out to the local Chamber of Commerce, and contacted the Small Business Association. Names of the deceived surfaced quickly. The owner of a small trucking company who'd lost 2 vehicles. The head of a sewing workshop who had mortgaged her equipment. A farmer who'd taken out a loan against his future harvest. All had been swindled in the same way. A charming man with bright eyes promised riches, convinced them to take loans, then vanished with their money. They had all filed police reports, but their cases sat gathering dust, lumped together under a single investigation into fraud by unidentified persons. They were scattered and powerless. But when a lawyer from a major construction firm called and said there was another victim, Daniel Stafford, the son of a local resident, Evelyn Stafford, and that there was a witness ready to expose the fraud, things began to move. For the first time, their collective losses had a name, a direction, a thread to follow. A quiet but powerful front was beginning to form. All the pieces were moving into place on the chessboard. 2 days before the dinner at the restaurant, the doorbell rang at Agnes's apartment. Standing on the threshold was Sebastian, tired from travel, but with clear, steady eyes. In his hands, he carried an old, worn leather briefcase. She led him into the living room and poured him tea. He sat in a comfortable chair, glancing around her bright, spacious apartment. And his gaze was quiet satisfaction. Your father wanted you to live exactly like this, he said simply. Free. Then he placed the briefcase on the table, carefully opened the clasps, and took out a thick cardboard folder tied with ribbon and sealed with several wax stamps. Here it is, he said, the last will and testament of Igor Stafford, intact and preserved. She looked at the folder as if it were a sacred relic, the key her father had mentioned. It wasn't in the note. It was here. I want to read everything again, Agnes said. Make sure I remember correctly, especially the part about the cottage property. Sebastian nodded. Of course. In these matters, nothing is trivial. He carefully broke the seals, untied the ribbon, and spread the yellowed pages across the table, each filled with neat, calligraphic handwriting and her father's signature at the bottom. Agnes quickly found the section she remembered. Everything was exactly as before. The land plot, with all buildings and the associated rights to natural resources, I bequeath in full and exclusive ownership to my daughter, Agnes Stafford. Black and white. Her brother and mother had no legal grounds to contest the transaction. She exhaled with relief. Her position was unassailable. She was about to close the folder when Sebastian gently stopped her hand. Wait, he said softly. You're only reading what you want to see. You need to read everything. Your father was a wise and far-sighted man. He never did anything without purpose. Let's go through it all, for the record. They started from the beginning. The list of assets, the standard legal language. Agnes listened absently, already mentally rehearsing the conversation to come at the restaurant. Then Sebastian fell silent, his eyes fixed halfway down a page. And this, he said slowly, with a curious note in his voice, this might be the most interesting part. Something you probably never noticed. He tapped a bony finger on one of the paragraphs. Listen carefully. The apartment located at, he named the address, the one her brother had received, is bequeathed to my son, Daniel Stafford, under one specific and non-transferable condition. Agnes leaned closer, reading along. Sebastian looked over his glasses, his gaze sharp. Your father, he said clearly, forbade the sale of that apartment, except under one single circumstance, if the entire amount from the sale was used to improve the family's well-being. For example, to buy another family home or fund the education of children. Any other sale, and especially the squandering of funds for personal use or questionable ventures, constitutes a direct violation of the will's terms. Violation of the will's terms. Those words echoed in Agnes's mind for the next 2 days leading up to the meeting. It wasn't just a detail, it was another trap, one she hadn't known existed. Her quiet, brilliant father, a geologist by profession, had seen far ahead. He'd known his son's nature, known that Daniel could only consume, not create. And so he had left behind a time bomb under his son's feet. And now, Agnes held the detonator. On Saturday evening, precisely at 10 minutes to 7, a pair arrived at the glowing entrance of La Verita. They looked as though they'd wandered in from another world, or another decade. Evelyn wore her best dress, the same one she'd worn at the birthday celebration. A year later, it seemed duller, tighter. Over her shoulders was a rough-knit cardigan. Daniel wore faded jeans and a wrinkled shirt, clearly pulled from the back of a closet. His face was puffy, his eyes dark and hollow. There was nothing left of the smug, well-groomed man he'd been a year ago. The doorman in livery opened the heavy glass doors for them. They stepped inside, and froze. They were struck by the silence, broken only by soft lounge music, the gentle clinking of glasses, and hushed voices. Huge crystal chandeliers glimmered above immaculate white tablecloths. Waiters in tailored uniforms moved soundlessly across the floor. Everything breathed true elegance, not the cheap imitation of the Golden Lion restaurant where they'd celebrated before. This was a world for different people, people who owned life itself. And Evelyn and Daniel felt like beggars who had stumbled into a palace. A tall, elegant maitre d' approached Francois. "Good evening. Are you expected?" he asked, his light French accent soft yet appraising. We're here to see Agnes Stafford," Evelyn stammered, blushing under his gaze. The name worked instantly. Francois's expression didn't change, but his posture became subtly more respectful. "Madam Stafford. Of course. Your table is ready. Please follow me." He led them through the dining hall, past tables filled with prominent figures, city officials, business leaders, socialites. Evelyn and Daniel could feel the curious, puzzled eyes on their backs. Francois brought them to the center table, the best in the house, slightly elevated, overlooking the entire room. They were on display, under the lights. "Madam Stafford will join you shortly," he said, pulling out a chair for Evelyn, something that had never happened to her in her life. "Would you care for an aperitif?" They mumbled something incoherent, and he nodded politely before stepping away. They sat together at the massive round table, afraid to move. Daniel grabbed the leather-bound menu, opened it, saw the prices, and slammed it shut. "She's insane," he hissed. "She did this on purpose." Exactly at 7 o'clock, Agnes entered. She didn't sneak in, she walked calmly, confidently. She wore a simple but perfectly tailored dress in deep wine red. No flashy jewelry, only a thin pearl necklace. Her hair was styled in an elegant chignon. She didn't look rich. She looked dignified. Francois hurried to greet her. "Good evening, Agnes. Your guests are here." "Thank you, Francois. Everything's fine." She walked to the table. Her mother and brother stared at her, a mixture of hatred, envy, and barely concealed confusion flickering in their eyes. The power had shifted. It was palpable in the air. The hierarchy that had ruled their family for decades was overturned in a single moment. She sat down, nodding at them in greeting. A waiter approached, and she ordered a bottle of expensive mineral water. "So," she said once the waiter left, "I'm listening." They didn't bother with small talk. The plaintive cry and repent vanished instantly. Her calm confidence infuriated them. Her mother spoke first, taking on the role of the victim. "How could you, Agnes?" she whispered theatrically, her voice trembling. "How could you do this to us? We're your family. You knew about that land, knew what it was worth, and you just stole it from us." "It wasn't theft," Agnes corrected her calmly. "It was a transaction." "A transaction?" Daniel exploded, unable to contain himself any longer. He was almost hissing, but his whisper dripped with venom. "You lied to your own mother. You left your brother penniless. Everything you got, those were our funds. Family funds. By law, you owe us half. We've consulted people." The tension at their table was almost tangible now. Guests at nearby tables began glancing over. "We're ruined because of you," Evelyn went on, her voice shaking with rage and self-pity. "Daniel has nothing left. The bank's taking my apartment. Your brother's out on the street, do you understand that? And you're sitting here in silk, throwing around our money. You owe us. You're obligated to help us. They spoke over each other, tripping on their own words, accusations, pleas, threats, and moral preaching, all tangled into one ugly torrent that spilled across the center of this temple of elegance and order. Agnes said nothing. She let them empty themselves out, staring at their faces twisted by hate, Daniel's darting eyes, her mother's trembling lips, and felt nothing. Just emptiness. Burned out ground. When the stream of words finally dried up, the sharp clink of a fork hitting a plate at a nearby table echoed through the silence. Everyone was waiting for her response, waiting for an explosion, for shouting, for tears. Agnes took a sip of water. Then she turned slowly to her brother. She looked straight into his eyes, wild, bitter, swollen with pride and despair, and spoke quietly but so clearly that every word cut through the room like glass. I can help. For a split second, hope flickered across Daniel's face. We're hiring a new dishwasher, Agnes continued in that same steady, toneless voice. Hard work, but steady pay. The job's yours if you want it. The silence that followed wasn't just soundless, it was dense, heavy, like cotton packed into everyone's ears. Even the background music seemed to vanish in fear. Daniel froze. The blood drained from his face, then rushed back in an ugly crimson wave. He stared at his sister, and in his eyes something broke, something small, something final. A dishwasher. She had just offered him, Daniel Stafford, the brilliant entrepreneur, the self-proclaimed genius, a job washing plates. Here, in front of the entire city. It wasn't an offer. It was a sentence. A public execution of his pride. And the humiliation was so overwhelming that the fragile dam of his self-control, already cracked, finally burst. He shot to his feet, shoving the heavy chair so hard that it screeched across the marble floor and slammed into a nearby table. The glass of water toppled over, spilling slowly across the immaculate white tablecloth. The entire restaurant, which had been pretending not to stare, was now openly watching. A dishwasher? Daniel's voice, shrill and breaking, tore through the air like an electric shock. He wasn't whispering anymore, he was screaming. Screaming so loudly the chandelier's crystal pendants trembled. You're offering me that? He jabbed a trembling finger at her, his face twisted beyond recognition. Who do you think you are? Did you forget who you are? He roared, spitting with rage. You're nothing. A nobody. We threw you out like a dog. Hear me? Evelyn grabbed his sleeve, trying desperately to pull him down. Her face had turned chalk white. Unlike her son, she understood exactly what was happening. This wasn't just a family argument anymore. It was a public disaster, unfolding live before the city's elite. Daniel, stop. Sit down, I said. She hissed, tugging at him. But he didn't hear her. He was in the eye of his own storm. He yanked her hand away. Don't touch me. Let them all hear. He turned to the frozen guests, eyes blazing with madness. You see her? You think she's some lady? I'll tell you who she really is. We laughed in her face on her birthday, our whole family did, because her place is in the dirt. I told her that myself. And my mother, he pointed toward Evelyn, my mother laughed the loudest. We gave her a stinking shack, and now she's playing queen with money she stole from us. Every word was another nail in the coffin of his and Evelyn's reputation. In his blind fury, Daniel was doing Agnes's work for her, spilling every ugly truth, confessing to every cruelty they had ever shown her. He was laying all their family's filth bare across the linen tablecloths. That money's mine, he raved on. Mine. Our father's. She's just a thief who robbed us blind. Evelyn covered her face with her hands. It was over. Completely, utterly over. She tried to stammer something, to say her son was unwell, drunk, but no sound came out. Daniel finally ran out of steam. He stood there panting in the middle of the room, like a cornered animal. In the heavy silence, his ragged breathing seemed deafening. Then he looked around and began to realize what he'd done. Dozens of eyes were fixed on him, cold, disgusted, curious, like a crowd at an autopsy. And at that moment, Agnes rose slowly to her feet, gracefully, without a single unnecessary motion. She didn't look at the guests. She looked at her brother and her mother, huddled small in her chair. She was completely calm. Her composure, next to his frenzy, was terrifying. She let her eyes sweep across the silent room and spoke, her voice low but clear, ringing to every corner. He's right. They did throw me out. The room gasped. No one expected that. She had agreed with him. Agnes paused, letting the words sink in. Then she turned her head and looked straight at her mother. Her gaze was cold as ice. But oh, mother, she said, with a faint, almost polite smile, I suppose I forgot to tell you the most important part. Her question, tossed into the ringing silence, made Evelyn flinch. She lifted her eyes to her daughter's face, bewildered, fearful. What else? What more could there be? You talk about theft, about family money, Agnes continued calmly, her voice carrying across the hall so that everyone could hear. But you never understood my father. You thought he was just like you. But he wasn't. He was different. He loved me. At the word loved, Evelyn's lips twisted into a scornful sneer, but she stayed silent. He knew what would happen to me after his death, Agnes said steadily. He knew your greed and your cruelty, and he prepared for it. Yes, he left me that old cottage. But as he wrote in his farewell note, you, mother, never understood the true secrets of the land. Beneath that dirt, the same dirt you told me I belonged in, was a unique underground spring of pure water. My father, a geologist, discovered it years ago and secretly registered all the rights for extraction. And those rights were legally tied to the land. She paused, letting their stunned faces sink in. So when you threw that folder at me, you didn't hand me a ruin. You gave me a treasure. You just didn't know it. She turned to her brother, who was still standing there, breathing heavily, his rage now turning into confusion. So I want you to understand one simple thing, brother. I didn't sell family property. I sold my property. In our father's will, and in a special addendum, it's written, black and white, the country estate, with all buildings and all associated resource rights, is bequeathed solely to my daughter, Agnes Stafford, in full and exclusive ownership. You never had any rights to it, not to a single dollar from its sale. A quiet but distinct gasp rippled through the room. It was a devastating blow to his drunken accusations. Daniel staggered as if struck. He opened his mouth to argue but found no words. His claims crumbled to dust. But Agnes wasn't finished. She was dismantling them, slowly, deliberately, one strike at a time. And now, she said, her voice colder than before, let's talk about your apartment. The one you sold to start your brilliant business. Tell me, brother, did you ever actually read our father's will? The full version? Carefully? Daniel stared at her blankly. What will? He'd received the apartment, and that was that. What was there to read? I thought not, Agnes said, her tone edged with frost. What a pity. Sebastian, if you please. At that moment, from a table in the corner, a tall, thin elderly man in a dark suit rose to his feet. It was Sebastian Howell. He was holding the same folder sealed with wax. He walked over to their table and stood beside Agnes, his face stern and unyielding as he looked at Daniel and Evelyn. Evelyn gasped when she saw him. She recognized her late husband's old friend. And it finally hit her, this wasn't an emotional outburst. It was a carefully orchestrated reckoning. In accordance with the last will and testament of the late Igor Stafford, Sebastian began in his firm, official voice, the apartment bequeathed to his son, Daniel Stafford, carried a specific condition. He opened the folder and began to read, enunciating each word clearly. The sale of said apartment by the heir is prohibited, except in the case where all proceeds from such sale are used toward the purchase of another family residence or for a significant improvement in the family's overall welfare. He looked up from the page and met Daniel's eyes. You, Daniel Stafford, sold that apartment, invested the entire amount into a fraudulent scheme, and then squandered the rest on personal expenses. Therefore, you have directly violated the terms of the will, or, to use proper legal terminology, you are in breach of testament conditions. Daniel still didn't fully grasp it. So what? He muttered. What difference does that make now? Sebastian looked at him with thinly veiled pity, the kind reserved for a fool. Oh, it makes all the difference. You see, there's another clause in the will, one that specifies the consequences of such a violation. He lowered his gaze to the document again. The silence in the hall was absolute. In the event the heir fails to comply with or directly violates the specified condition, said inheritance shall be nullified in full, and all rights to the property shall be revoked. Daniel went pale as chalk. So that means? It means, the notary concluded for him, that legally speaking, you were never the rightful owner of that apartment. But it wasn't over yet. That was only the second to last blow. The final, fatal one came from Agnes herself. And now for the most interesting part, brother, she said, her voice devoid of any trace of pity. Since you sold that apartment without full legal ownership, the entire sale itself is fraudulent, which gives the new owners, the people you sold it to, the absolute right to take you to court and demand a full refund of the money they paid. Every last cent. She took a step toward him. So you're not just bankrupt, Daniel. You don't just owe the bank a massive loan. You now also owe the full price of the apartment to its new owners. You're not at the bottom. You're in a legal and financial abyss you'll never climb out of. Her words hung in the air like smoke after a gunshot. Daniel swayed on his feet, his face gray and hollow. He looked at his sister, at the notary, at the stunned guests, but saw no one. His mind, built for simple equations, take, spend, repeat, couldn't process the complex, merciless finality of the disaster engulfing him. He wasn't just bankrupt. He was a criminal. Francois, the maitre d', was the first to move. He discreetly signaled to security, and two men in dark suits appeared silently beside Daniel. There was no aggression, no force. They simply stood by, ready for whatever might come next. The scene was over. Agnes calmly sat back down and took a sip of water, as if nothing had happened. Sebastian carefully folded the wool back into the folder and returned to his seat in the corner. Evelyn, hunched and shattered, tried to stand, tried to speak, but only managed a faint moan. Daniel finally stirred from his stupor and allowed the guards to escort him out without resistance. He walked like an automaton, eyes on the floor, stumbling over his own feet. All his arrogance, his swagger, his smug self-assurance had fallen away, leaving only a broken, frightened 40-year-old man. Evelyn sat alone at the enormous table, a puddle of spilled water spreading before her. She was the center of attention, but had never felt more utterly alone. Slowly, she rose and shuffled toward the exit, not meeting anyone's eyes. No one said a word to her. Behind her, whispers began to swell, soft at first, then louder, until the room buzzed with them. But that was only the beginning. The real nightmare began the next morning. Just as Agnes had predicted, the public humiliation triggered a chain reaction. The story of the scandal at La Verita spread through the city before dawn. But this wasn't just gossip anymore. Thanks to dozens of influential witnesses, it became an indisputable fact. Daniel Stafford wasn't just a failure, he was a conman who had deceived his own family and violated his father's last will. That was when Victor's legal team struck again. The victims of Glen Osborne, the farmer, the sewing shop owner, and the rest, banded together under their guidance and filed a joint complaint with the police. But this time, they didn't accuse unknown persons. They accused Glen Osborne and Daniel Stafford of organized fraud. Their statements, backed by the apartment sale violation, painted Daniel not as a naive victim but as a greedy, foolish accomplice. By Monday morning, a police car pulled up outside Evelyn's apartment. Two officers politely but firmly asked Daniel to come with them for questioning. He was arrested. No handcuffs, no shouting, but no escape either. That evening, the local news aired the story. Suspect detained in connection with a string of fraud cases. On screen, for a few seconds, appeared Daniel's photo, the same one from his college honor board, the one his mother had once shown off with pride. For Evelyn, the world collapsed completely. No one came to visit. The phone stayed silent. Those who once sought her friendship now crossed the street to avoid her. Neighbors stopped saying hello. She was trapped in a vacuum of total social isolation. Even Nellie wasn't spared. Her name surfaced in whispers as the Stafford family's close friend. Rumors spread that she'd been the one digging for information about the cottage, pushing Evelyn and Daniel into action. Society branded her an accomplice. Everyone turned away. Her attempts to cozy up to the powerful had finally backfired. A week later, Evelyn received an official notice from the bank. Foreclosure proceedings had begun. Her apartment, the last thing she had left, was being put up for auction. That evening, she broke. Her entire life, built on glorifying one child and crushing the other, had been a lie that led her straight to ruin. 40 years of self-delusion had turned to dust. In despair, on the edge of madness, she found the unknown number in her phone, the one Agnes had called from. She didn't know if her daughter would answer, but it was her last confession. Agnes picked up after the first ring. "Damn you to hell," Evelyn screamed, her voice raw, animal, more a howl than a cry. "You destroyed everything. You ruined your brother. You took everything from me. For what? What did he ever do worse than you? Why did your father do this? Why did he always love only you?" Agnes said nothing. Her eyes were cold, filled with equal parts hatred and pain. She waited. She knew the moment of truth was coming. And it came. Choking on tears and words, Evelyn screamed out the secret she had carried inside her for 40 years. The secret that had poisoned her soul and destroyed her family. Because he wasn't sure Daniel was his son. That's why. Agnes froze. "I had an affair," Evelyn confessed, her voice trembling into a whisper. A short, stupid one. Right around the time you were born. My husband found out, not everything, but enough to suspect. He never said it outright, but I saw it in his eyes. Until the day he died, he doubted Daniel was his child. And all his love for you, all his care, that was his way of making sure his legacy, his name, went to his real blood, to his true daughter. And I spent my whole life trying to prove him wrong. I raised Daniel up, poured everything into him. I hated you because you were a living reminder, a constant reproach. I wanted to make Daniel so great that your father, wherever he is now, would finally see how wrong he'd been. I just wanted him to love my son. The call went dead. Agnes stood there for a few seconds, holding the phone to her ear, listening to the silence. And that silence drowned 40 years of lies, 40 years of undeserved hatred, 40 years of blind, toxic obsession. Everything fell into place. Every cruel joke, every unfair remark, every humiliating gift, none of it had been random malice. It was a war her mother had been fighting against the ghost of her father's doubt. And Agnes, his unquestioned daughter, had been the eternal enemy in that war. While Daniel, the son whose paternity his own mother doubted, had been her flag, her proof, her lifelong crusade to vindicate herself. Agnes slowly set the phone down. And she felt nothing. No anger, no triumph, not even pity. Only a cold, crystal clear understanding. And relief. As if a massive, invisible weight she'd carried since birth had finally fallen from her shoulders. She was free. 2 weeks later, they met for the last time. The meeting was set in the office of Arnold Baker, the same attorney who had helped Agnes with the sale. A sleek conference room on the 25th floor, overlooking the city that had become her home. Evelyn came alone. In 2 weeks, she seemed to have aged 10 years. She sat on the edge of a leather chair, hunched, afraid to touch anything. Her eyes, red and swollen from crying, were fixed on a single spot on the polished table. She was utterly broken. The foreclosure process had begun. The auction for her apartment had taken place the previous day. She had come here without knowing why, summoned by the lawyer like someone awaiting a sentence. Agnes entered the room with Victor beside her. He said nothing, but his calm, steady presence made it clear she wasn't alone anymore. Arnold cleared his throat and opened a folder of documents. Evelyn, he began formally, I've called you in to finalize the last procedures regarding your son's debt. As you know, your apartment was auctioned off yesterday. Evelyn flinched but didn't speak. The apartment has been sold. The amount received fully covered the bank's claim, including penalties and fees. Legally, you no longer owe anything. However, he paused. You are also no longer the property's owner. It was a verdict. Delivered quietly, almost casually, homelessness at 70. I understand, Evelyn whispered, staring at the table. However, the lawyer continued, there's one more detail. The buyer was a private investment company. And today, its representative authorized me to give you this. He took a set of keys from the table, the keys to her apartment, and placed them in front of her. Evelyn stared at them, uncomprehending. What is this? The company that purchased the property, Agnes said evenly, her voice calm and emotionless, is under my control. I bought your apartment. Evelyn lifted her gaze to her daughter. Disbelief flickered in her eyes, then astonishment, then a desperate spark of hope. She looked at the keys again, then back at Agnes. Could it be? Could there still be something human left in her? Agnes, sweetheart, she whispered, and tears rolled down her wrinkled cheeks, this time, real tears of relief. She reached for the keys, her fingers trembling. You won't live on the street, Agnes said, stopping her hand with a cold, steady look. You can stay in that apartment for the rest of your life. Evelyn sobbed, clutching her chest. Thank God, thank you, I knew. But there's one condition, Agnes cut her off, her voice turning to steel. Evelyn froze. The tears stopped mid-fall. Daniel must never set foot in that apartment, ever. The hope in her eyes vanished, replaced by horror and confusion. But how? He's my son. When he gets out, where will he go? That's not my problem anymore, Agnes said coldly. You've been making choices your whole life, mother. Always choosing one child and rejecting the other. You made your bet, and you lost. Now it's time to face the consequences. You wanted to choose your child? Now you have. Permanently. She looked straight into her mother's eyes, and Evelyn saw there not hatred, but something far worse, complete, merciless indifference. Evelyn looked down at the keys on the table. A moment ago, they'd been a symbol of salvation. Now they were the symbol of her eternal loneliness. She would have a home, but no purpose in it. A roof over her head, but nothing, and no one, beneath it. Agnes stood up. Victor rose with her. "That's all," she said to the lawyer. "You can handle the rest without me." She turned and walked to the door without a single glance back. Victor followed. They stepped out of the gleaming skyscraper into the sunlit street. Agnes drew a deep breath, taking in the air of a living, bustling city. She didn't feel like a conqueror who had crushed her enemies. Her victory wasn't in their destruction. It was in her own undeniable, public restoration. She had reclaimed her name. She had fulfilled her father's will, preserving his legacy, the family home, but on her own terms. She had finally built a future she had never dared to dream of. Victor quietly placed his hand on her shoulder, and in that simple gesture was more warmth and understanding than in all her mother's embraces over 40 years. Agnes looked at him, and for the first time in many, many years, a faint, genuine smile appeared on her face. The confession was complete. Ahead lay life. And that's how this difficult, but deeply meaningful story ends. A story about betrayal, about blind maternal love that turned out more destructive than hate, and about dignity, the kind you can reclaim, even when it seems everything is lost. And now, dear listeners, I want to ask you, do you think Agnes did the right thing? Was her revenge justified? Or did she go too far, leaving her mother in loneliness and her brother to his ruins? What would you have done in her place? Would you have forgiven? Helped without conditions? Or would you have done the same, putting every dot over every I? We'd love to hear your thoughts. Please, share your opinion in the comments. What do you think about this story and the choices its characters made? If something touched you, or if a moment felt especially powerful, tell us about it below. Your feedback means the world to us. And of course, if this story moved you, please give this video a like and subscribe to our channel. It helps us create more stories for you. We wish you peace in your heart and good people by your side. All the very best to you. At the end of this video, you'll see a box appear in the middle of the screen. Please click on it to watch some of our other most compelling stories.